Hare Krishna. Welcome to the Ministry of Education's course on Instructional Design. Whenever we do anything in Krishna's service, we want to become daksha or expert in that service. Certainly that expertise comes from our personal purity and realizations, our good sadhana, our studying of the scripture, but it also comes from putting in the time and energy to learn and practice the craft of what we are doing. We can think about Arjuna, who spent so much of his time just learning how to shoot really carefully and exactly. So in this course, we're going to be teaching how to be expert in the craft of teaching. Now, we're not going to be teaching you how to teach exactly, but how to plan your teaching. This course is called Instructional Design, and it is how to plan and design what you are going to teach. We're starting out with just mini lessons to introduce you to different topics. Please come back regularly because we do plan to expand more and more details in each of the topics, as well as adding more topics. As you're going through each of the lessons, we suggest that you pause, think about what you're hearing, perhaps write down some of your own ideas, and then come back and listen again. What are the topics that we have in this particular course? The first one is how to identify the needs and opportunities of the people you'll be teaching so that you can have a match between what you're teaching and what they need. The second is to find what already exists to meet those needs so we don't reinvent the wheel. The third is to clearly define your own aims and objectives in teaching. What is the purpose for which you're teaching that one class or a whole multi-class course? The next one is to identify what you want your pupils or participants to be able to demonstrate by the end of your class or your course. What are your objectives that the students will achieve? The next one will be to understand the nature and the qualifications of the people that you're teaching and to adjust your teaching accordingly. We'll also be considering how time affects teaching. Then the various resources that we use in teaching, how to gather them, how to use them, how to identify what we call the irreducible minimum. What is the most basic thing that your students have to master in order to achieve those objectives? Then how to choose appropriate learning experiences or teaching methods to achieve your objectives with the particular students that you have. How to make mastery easy for your students. How to assess or evaluate whether or not and to what degree your students have achieved their objectives, and also levels of learning according to Bloom. Hare Krishna. Hare Krishna. Welcome to the Ministry of Education course on Instructional Design. This is a lesson on how to identify your students' needs and opportunities so that we can match what we teach to what they need. I'm sure you found that sometimes we remember and use what we learn and sometimes we don't. Often we feel that teaching is effective if I just get up and teach. But really teaching is effective only if somebody learns, if they remember that learning and they use that learning. But we only learn things, remember, and use the learning when that learning meets something that we need. Now, sometimes we have physical needs, how to drive a car, how to cook. Other times it may be more of an emotional need, how to get along with other people. But in any case, there has to be a need that goes beyond just taking an exam for us to actually learn something. So how are we going to find out what people need? Well, in one sense, people's needs are universal. And psychiatrists, psychologists, sociologists have identified some universal needs. We could list general categories of autonomy, connection, honesty, play, peace, meaning, and security. So, for example, people need a sense of autonomy. They need a sense that, okay, I'm directing my own life, I'm making my own choices, I have some control over my life, I can be the kind of person that I want to be. That is an essential need. Another essential need is for connection. Connection with other people, connection with animals, connection with the environment, ultimately connection with God. Of course, that is the literal definition of yoga. Then there's authenticity or truth. We all want to know that what we have is genuine, it's real, we're not being cheated, it's not something fake. And that need for authenticity is very deep in the human being. Then there's a need for fun and play. Now, Krishna is always engaged in lila or krida, and we as his parts and parcels actually need play and recreation. Then we have a need for peace. We have a need for equilibrium, for serenity, for being unaffected by the ups and downs of the world. And we have a need for meaning. We have a need to know that what we do, what we accomplished, who we are, has some value, it has some purpose, that we're not just simply wasting our time with no value. And we have a need for security. We need to feel safe physiologically, we need to feel safe emotionally, socially, and spiritually. So in one sense, we can use these universal needs when planning our instruction. If what we're teaching doesn't meet at least one of these universal needs of students, and if our students don't recognize that what we're teaching meets at least one of those needs, they won't be very interested in what we're teaching. Now, although we've talked about these general universal needs in a very broad sense, most of us don't wake up in the morning saying, oh, I need authenticity, or, oh, I just need some peace. We usually think in terms of something more specific. I need to figure out how to have a way to pay my car insurance. I need to figure out how to get along better with my child. I need to make more money at work. Now, all of these are related to, say, connection or security or authenticity, but we may not be thinking in those terms. So our teaching also needs to have some connection to the immediate felt needs of our students. We have to be very careful in this regard that we're not aiming at our specific felt needs rather than that of the students. So I was at one Hare Krishna community where I was asked to teach a group of children how to be more respectful to their elders. And I said, if you advertise that topic, then the kids won't exactly be very interested. You certainly won't get the teenagers. Okay, we're going to have a class on how to respect your elders more. Right? What are the kids interested in? The little kids are interested in play and fun and friends. The older kids are interested in, how to deal with the opposite sex and how to pass their exams and how to understand their nature and get a good job. So you want to be very, very careful when we say, what are the specific things that the people I'm teaching need, that we think in terms of what they identify that they need, rather than what I think they should need. And we can say, well, I already know what everybody thinks they should need. In a general sense, that's certainly true. But when we're going for specifics, it's a wise idea to be humble. What Krishna says is the first item of knowledge, and to figure that we probably don't know exactly what the people we're teaching feel that they need in a specific way. So at least once or twice a year, or whenever we're going to teach in a new place with new people, we want to take the time to really find out what are the needs and the opportunities of the people that we're teaching. So one of the ways that we can do this is directly, by asking direct questions. And we can ask these direct questions of our student as a group. We can say, what are the biggest problems that you think people face today? Or what are some areas of your life you'd like us to address in future classes? What topics would you like us to teach in the next semester? All the questions should always be open-ended. Now, besides asking open-ended questions to the group, we can also have low-key interviews with individual students. We can ask questions like, well, are there some reasons why the class might be feeling some sort of pressure right now? Or what struggles are your kids facing? How do you think debt is affecting families in this community? So, we can choose areas that we think might relate to individual needs and ask them in interviews. One method I have found to be very effective is having anonymous questions. So going into a group of people you're going to teach and having maybe on little index cards or pieces of paper that you pass out to people with pens and pencils. And you just say, all right, don't put your name on these, and just answer questions like, the biggest problem in my life is, or the Krishna conscious practices I have the most difficulty with are, or I also struggle with, when I get depressed, the reason is, the biggest worry in my life is. And putting these kind of questions, maybe 3 or 4 of the ones that we mentioned, asking them then to put this on the index cards and pass it up to you. Now, sometimes you can, if it's a small group, you can then tailor your teaching in that moment to those needs. And other times you collect this and you'll need this. You'll use this for future classes. You can also interview family members and ask, okay, I have your son or your daughter or your husband, your wife in my class. Can you tell me something about what you think are the issues that this person would be facing? To have personal visits to students' homes, to really get to know your community by visiting their homes, spending time with them, spending time with their family, and just observing people. What do they talk about? What is their body language? So those are all direct methods. Then there are indirect methods. So what books are people reading? Whenever I visit a new temple or a temple I haven't been to for a while, I always go into the gift shop and see what are the books that people are buying? What are they selling? Now, not only the devotional books, but what books are people in your demographics, people of your age, race, gender, economic status, etc. What are they reading? What are the magazines, newspapers, blogs, etc. that, again, the people you're teaching are reading? And this may be print or online. And particularly look at question and answer sections of those magazines, periodicals, and blogs. What are the questions that people are asking that they would like answers to in their life? You can also look at research studies and polls that deal with the demographics of the people that you're teaching. And you can question individuals that deal a lot with the public or deal a lot, again, with those demographics. So, hairdressers, people who work in restaurants, maybe other traveling preachers or counselors in the area. And without sacrificing anonymity, just what are the kinds of questions that people are asking? What are the sorts of problems that they're bringing up? Because you'll find that in each community, they're going to be a top 5 or 10 questions. Now, what do you do with this information? You make sure that what you're teaching meets the needs of the people you're teaching. If you're teaching something that doesn't have relationship and an explicit, open, and obvious relationship to what people need, they're not really going to pay attention. They're not going to learn. They're not going to retain the learning. They're not going to use that learning in their life. And eventually, if regularly teaching does not meet people's needs, people will just stop coming to classes and they'll go elsewhere to get those needs met. Thank you. Hare Krishna. Hare Krishna. Welcome to the Ministry of Education course in Instructional Design. In this lesson, we're going to be going over something that may cut your time and energy down to a half or maybe even a tenth. And that is, once you've identified the needs and opportunities, before you start designing your own lesson or course, see if there's something out there that already exists that you can use. Now, where are you going to look? Well, it's really a matter of making connections. Making connections. The first place you're going to connect is with people who are doing a similar service. You're a teacher, other people who are teaching. Do they have any materials? You want to put together a course on forgiveness because you see that people really have a need to have harmonious relationships. You can ask other people who are teaching, hey, you have any good materials on forgiveness? Do you know where I could get something? Then asking people in your same location, even if they're not doing the same service. Hey, are you aware of anything that anyone's already using in this location to meet this need? Any resources out there for how to help your kids to behave better, or how to chant your japa better. And they may say, oh yeah, we have this book in the gift shop here in the temple, and a lot of devotees have been buying it. Oh, I didn't even know the book existed. Then connections from those in different services. You don't know that maybe somebody who's a cook in the temple kitchen or dressing the deities or something very different from what you're doing may say, I know of really something that would help you with that. Something that I used, or this is something my sister's brother-in-law used. And then in different locations, to go beyond your community. Going beyond your community to people in both the same and different services. So within your community, people who do the same service and different services, and beyond your community, people who do the same service and different services. With the internet, we can often connect all over the world very easily. And when you connect with people, you can also ask them, hey, do you know of anybody in another place who might have something that I can use, might have something that I can refer to? It amazes me how I'll go from one devotee community to another, and in each different community, there's somebody working on the same thing, not knowing that there's somebody in the other community who's already started it. Then going out of ISKCON, other people who are devotees of Krishna, but not members of ISKCON, perhaps other members of the Gaudiya Math or other sampradayas, do they have anything? Is there anything that's worked in their community? Maybe they have a handbook on grihastha relationships, or maybe they have something on meditation, or whatever it is, whatever need that you're trying to meet might already exist, and you might be able to use a large part of it, or even just a particular lesson, or a particular quote, or a particular resource. And then not only specifically devotees of Krishna, but people who are religious but not Krishna devotees. So we're looking at, the Christians, the Muslims, the Jews, the Buddhists. Is there perhaps a book or a course or some sort of resource, pictures, videos that might relate to what you're teaching and you can bring in and use as part of your own course? Then connection with people who aren't devotees at all, people who are out in the secular world. Even people who aren't devotees want to have nice marital relationships, want to be forgiving, want to find a way to de-stress their lives. We are talking about often universal needs, and many times people who have no connection with anything theistic will still have something that you can say, wow, I can use this. I don't have to recreate it myself. Now, in addition to our going out and doing the research in our locality with people who do the same service and different services, out of our locality, same service, different service, out of our community into the greater Vaishnav world and the even bigger secular world, we're still relying on people that we know. But we can also connect with people who know people. Some people have as their great benediction in life, their great talent in life, that they know dozens or hundreds or thousands of people. Connect with the people persons, with the networkers, and say, hey, do you know anyone in your network who might know or know of anyone who knows of anyone who knows of anyone who has a resource I can use to meet this need? Then you have the people I call the cosmic librarians. They may not know people, but they know resources. And if you go to those people and say, hey, is there any resource on this? They might say, Bhaktivinoda wrote something on this topic that I think you would find helpful. Or, I have an article written by a devotee in Sweden that you would find helpful. So you also want to have as your good friends some networking people and some cosmic librarians. In this way, instead of just sitting down with a blank screen or a blank piece of paper and saying, all right, I really want to meet this need, how am I going to go about doing it? First, look around and see what already exists. Although certainly you should customize your teaching for your own personality style and the unique situations of your audience. At the same time, there's a lot out there that you can already use to cut your time and energy way down in all of your teaching. Thank you. Hare Krishna. Hare Krishna. In this lesson of instructional design, we're going to be looking at writing our aims, whether it's for one particular class or for a group of classes. So aims are about the purpose of our lesson. Each individual lesson should have an aim, and also the purpose for the course as a whole. But it's from the perspective of the teacher or the writer of the course, with the idea that this is what I want to achieve in order to meet the needs of my students. So it's my hopes, my intentions about the outcome of the lesson, and they're general statements that describe the overall purpose of the lesson. They're about you as the teacher or the organization that you're part of, and what are your intentions. So you look at the needs, you say, all right, people really need to be inspired about getting up early in the morning. They need to participate in early morning sadhana, and they need to do that in order to have higher quality japa. So people are saying, I wish I could improve my japa, and so that's their need that they understand. And my aim is to help them to wake up early in the morning as a way of helping them improve their japa. Now, many times the aims of the teacher or the organization are hard to assess precisely, but they still direct what you're doing. Now, your aims answer questions such as, what do I hope the learners are going to know about, understand, achieve, develop, or be more confident in at the end of my instruction as compared to the beginning? Now, for example, an aim could be to help devotees feel more confident about their teaching and their facilitation of group processes, or to help beginner photographers produce technically good quality photographs and explore their creativity in producing images. Now you'll notice that each of those aims began with the word to, and they also describe the audience, devotees, beginning photographers. To write an aim, it may help if you consider, if someone asks me, what am I going to get out of this course? Why should I take it? Why do I need it? What would I answer? I would say, hey, this will really help you take better quality photographs. Or this will really help you get your good morning sadhana together. Your aim should be as clear and as focused as possible. Make sure when you write an aim, it begins with the word to. It should have a verb, to help, to encourage, to inspire, to facilitate. And it should say who, to facilitate devotees, to help photographers, to help parents, to inform people considering marriage, to inspire brahmacharis. Now really look inward to find what is your aim. Why are you teaching? If you're teaching just because somebody asked you to teach and you don't know what else to do, and that's not going to work. You need to have a reason that you're teaching. You need to have something in mind that you feel is going to meet that need or opportunity that you have identified in your students. Wow, they need this, there's an opportunity, and this is what I would like to do in order to meet that need. If you don't have any kind of aim in yourself, better you don't teach something. You'd be excited about it. You ask yourself, well, what is it I want to do? Am I excited about doing this? Make sure your aim is realistic for the time that you have available. If you only have a half an hour, then you're not going to be able to communicate all of the themes in the Bhagavad Gita. Thank you very much. Hare Krishna. Hare Krishna. In this lesson on instructional design, we're going to look at planning our learning objectives. Now, we already had a little mini lesson on aims. Aims is what you as the teacher want to do, what you want to accomplish. An objective is what you want your student to accomplish. For every aim that you write as far as what you want to accomplish, there has to be a corresponding objective as to what you want the students to accomplish. Now, sometimes one aim can have 3 or 4 objectives, and sometimes 3 or 4 objectives can go with 3 or 4 aims. but every aim has to have an objective. The objectives direct your learning experiences. They direct what you're actually going to do. And as we will see in the lesson on assessment, they're completely linked to assessment. The objectives determine the assessment determine the objectives. Objectives, what you want to do. Assessment is how well, to what extent have you done what you want to do. Let's look at a quote from Srila Prabhupada. We can read this together. Srila Prabhupada says, "If you have no goal, there is example, man without aim is ship without any rudder. So suppose if airplane is going with an aim to land in some country, but if he goes on simply without any aim, then there will be disaster. So without aim, what is the use of practice?" Prithuputra says, "He says he likes to practice without goal." Srila Prabhupada responds, "That is foolishness. Without goal, practicing something, it is foolishness." That's from a conversation on the 13th of June in 1974. Your objective is what knowledge do you want your students to be able to demonstrate at the end of your teaching that they couldn't have demonstrated at the beginning? Or what skills do you want them to be able to do? Do you want them to be able to show at the end of your teaching that they couldn't do at the beginning? Very important. Objectives should always be written in the form of a to-do statement. Not students will know the names in Sanskrit of the three Purusha avatars, but students will be able to write down, or students will be able to cite. These are called explicit objectives. They must be observable and measurable. By observable means something that you can see with a camera or you can hear with a microphone. Be careful you avoid in objectives. Students will know, students will understand, they will appreciate. No, none of those. Students will be able to list, students will be able to explain, students will be able to teach. Something where they're demonstrating their knowledge or demonstrating their skills, and you can watch and hear what they're doing. Very explicit, observable, and measurable. Objectives say exactly what the students will be able to do by the end of the lesson or course, which shows whether or not and to what degree you've met those aims. We suggest that you always begin writing your objectives with these words. By the end of the course, or by the end of the lessons, students will be able to. By the end of the course, by the end of the lesson, students will be able to. If you use that language, it will prevent you from putting in these vague, unaccessible words like know and understand and be enthused. So you want to have an active verb. At the end of the lesson, students will be able to write down, students will be able to list, students will be able to explain, students will be able to cook. Something you can observe or see happening where you can say, all right, if they do this objective, I have met my aims. We can't say this enough. When you're writing objectives, use the standard wording, even if you have been teaching for 20 years. At the end of the lesson, students will be able to. And again, we can't emphasize enough, every aim must have a corresponding objective. That doesn't mean that there's one aim, one objective, but every aim has to have one or more objectives that cover it, and every objective has to correspond with one or more aims. Now, there are many common mistakes people do when they're trying to decide and write down learning objectives. So we're going to look at 5 of these common mistakes. One of them is instead they write the learning experiences, what the student will do during the lesson. Or they write what the teacher's activities are, what the teacher will do, or the topic or the content. We're going to study about lizards, or we're going to study about japa. Or statements using non-active verbs. Students will know, students will understand, students will appreciate. Or anything outside the time frame, anything that you can't observe in the lesson. So we're going to look at some examples of things. Some of these are actual objectives and some of them are something else. Now, we haven't put this yet in the form of a quiz. Right now, we're just giving you an example and then what it is, so you can see what is and is not an objective. So here you see in these 4 examples, 2 of them are aims, 1 of them is an objective, and 1 is a learning experience. And we have these 4 examples here to help you distinguish between aims, learning objectives, and learning experiences. So let's look at the first one. To convince students. Well, right there should tell you you've got an aim. An aim starts with to, and it has the audience. So to convince students of the importance of formal education within ISKCON and to equip them with the corresponding skills. That's an aim of the teacher. Let's look at the next one. To broaden students' understandings of teaching styles and methods and to specifically introduce them to interactive and experiential learning. Again, to broaden students. Well, that's something I am aiming to do as the teacher, not something the students are going to be demonstrating. Let's look at the third one. Students should be able to write down the 3 broad categories of teaching styles and explain one in detail. Oh, that's an objective. Now, we personally didn't put at the end of the course, right at the beginning of it, to make sure that you could recognize it even without that wording. Students should be able to, and something active, write down, explain. Let's look at the 4th one. Students will watch the video, Your Ever Well Wisher. That's not our aim. It's not an objective. It's simply a learning experience. So in planning your instruction, after you write your aims as the teacher, then make sure that every aim has at least 1 learning objective where you can measure what the students will be able to do at the end of the course that demonstrate that your aim has been achieved. Thank you. Hare Krishna. Hare Krishna. In this lesson on instructional design, we're going to be considering the particular nature, qualifications, and mood of our audience in terms of what we're going to be teaching and to what level of depth. Now, Shastra and our acharyas put a lot of emphasis on the specific nature of those we teach in terms of what content we can teach and what depth we can go with that content. Now, I'd like each of us to think about what instructions from Srila Prabhupada and our acharyas or Shastra relate to modifying our teaching according to the natures of those we teach. Let's look at some examples. This is a very well-known example. This is from the Nectar of Devotion, Chapter 8, Offenses to be Avoided. And this particular example is about people's degree of faith, people's degree of sinfulness, people's degree of purification, that if you tell somebody something that's beyond their level of faith and purity, you may end up inciting them to be disrespectful. Let's read this. It is an offense to the holy name to instruct a faithless person about the glories of the holy name. Anyone can take part in chanting the holy name of the Lord, but in the beginning, one should not be instructed about the transcendental potency of the Lord. Those who are too sinful cannot appreciate the transcendental glories of the Lord, and therefore it is better not to instruct them in this matter. So because people don't have an appreciation, they therefore may become disrespectful, and they may become offensive, and then it becomes offensive on our part that I've induced them to become offensive. Let's look at some more examples. Now here's one that I'm sure, again, most of us are very familiar with. This is about the fact that reading of the 10th canto should not happen until people have read the first 9 cantos. So this particular example is about what specific content we're going to teach. The people just won't understand it. They'll misunderstand it, and again, they'll commit offenses, they'll be disrespectful. So let's look at this quote. It's from the book Second Chance, Chapter 16, Awakening Love of God. Therefore, we instruct everyone, first of all, to read the first 9 cantos of the Srimad Bhagavatam very carefully. Then one may read the 10th canto with proper understanding. Those who hear about Krishna's Rasalila and take it as an ordinary story cannot know Krishna in truth. The Rasalila is not an affair of lust. It is a transcendental pastime of love between Radha and Krishna. According to Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, the chapters of the Srimad Bhagavatam describing the Rasa Leela are not meant for ordinary persons. They are meant for liberated persons only. Therefore, these descriptions of the Rasa Leela should not be described to ordinary people. Those who are advanced devotees, liberated from material contamination, can try to understand Krishna's Rasa Leela. One must not try to imagine the Rasa Leela of Radha and Krishna in mundane terms. So this is talking about the audience qualification, again in terms of purity, in terms of understanding that Krishna is God in the first 9 cantos of the Bhagavatam. Of course, we may ask why Srila Prabhupada created the Krishna book before he had translated the 9 cantos of the Bhagavatam, but what we find is that in the Krishna book, Srila Prabhupada is interweaving philosophy and Leela in such a way that people will not understand. So this particular quote gives us some idea that if people are not qualified to understand very high and esoteric subjects, either not to teach them at all, or to teach them in a way where we're interweaving philosophical truths such that there's no possibility that people will misunderstand. I don't think anyone who reads Srila Prabhupada's Krishna book has any misunderstanding about the nature of Ras Leela. Let's look at another example. So this is from Prabhupada's purport in the Bhagavatam 6:16-26. And again, it's about a person's disposition and purification, and also about their life experiences. Let's look at this quote. When Angira had first come to visit King Chitraketu, he did not bring Narada with him. However, after the death of Chitraketu's son, Angira brought Narada to instruct King Chitraketu about Bhakti Yoga. The difference was that in the beginning, Chitraketu was not in a temperament of renunciation, but after the death of his son, when he was overwhelmed by his great plight, he was awakened to the platform of renunciation by instructions regarding the falsity of this material world and material possessions. It is only at this stage that Bhakti Yoga can be instructed. As long as one is attached to material enjoyment, Bhakti Yoga cannot be understood. So many times when we're looking at our audience, we have to think, what kind of life experiences have they been through? What have they learned from their life experiences? What mood are they in? Now, sometimes the mood of an audience at a particular time might be such that you can open up topics that you couldn't open up with that same audience at another time. Let's look at this quote. This is from a lecture from Srimad Bhagavatam on 122 on May 26, 1974 in Rome. Now here Srila Prabhupada is talking about what we ask people to do. In our learning objectives, we wanted to assess and have a plan as to what students would be able to demonstrate as far as their knowledge, but also what they'd be able to demonstrate as far as skills. In this quote, Srila Prabhupada is talking about not exactly knowledge, but behavior and skills. Whether or not people can follow the 4 regulative principles, whether they can wake up early in the morning, and so forth. Let's take a look at this quote. In the beginning, we do not ask anybody to become initiated or a brahmana. No, we simply invite a person to join the chanting. This is our process. We should strictly follow this. In the beginning, we should not ask that you have to do this, you have to. He cannot do that. That is not possible. So if we have an audience of people who haven't really practiced Krishna consciousness, and the first thing that we say is give up all illicit sex, then they may just turn around and walk out the door. Better that we engage them in chanting, and after they become purified and attracted by chanting, then we can start telling them the different rules and regulations. So considering all these and many similar instructions, before we plan what we teach, and certainly before we begin to teach, it's absolutely imperative that we ascertain, who are I teaching? What are the qualifications of my students? Now, there are specific questions we can ask which will help us understand our students' qualification. Let's take a look at these. So our first question is, what do they already know? In planning my teaching, I want to both build on what people know and not assume they know what they don't know. So it's kind of a tension here where I don't want to teach them stuff they already know and they'll be like, okay, I'm bored with this. Nor do I want nor I want as a teacher to assume that they know what they don't know. If I just say, yeah, just like with Hiranyakashipu, and they're like, what is this? Hiranyakashipu, they have no idea who that is, what that is. I won't be able to make my point. Now, what people already know is a complicated question when you have a very mixed audience. If you're teaching at a Sunday feast where some people are coming to a temple for the first time and other people have been in the Krishna consciousness movement for 40 years, you kind of have to balance, all right, I've got to give a little bit of prior information for the people who are new, but not so much that I totally bore the senior people here. So when we say what do they know, we mean in terms of concepts. Are they familiar with karma, reincarnation? What about language? Do they know words like prasadam? What about stories? Do they know who the Pandavas are? Do they know who Hiranyakashipu is? So you want to make sure that you're tailoring things for what people already know. And then as we saw in one of those quotes, where Prabhupada was talking about you just try to get people to chant Hare Krishna before you ask them to take up all the practices, what are they practicing? What are people doing? So if you ask people to do a whole lot more than what they're already doing, they'll feel overwhelmed. And if you ask them to do things that they've already done 10 years ago, they're going to feel that you're condescending. So if people are meat eaters, you don't immediately want to say, okay, you need to eat food only cooked by devotees and offered to install deities and so forth. You can just talk about vegetarianism and very simple offering of food. If you're talking to people who are already offering their food to Krishna, then you can talk about increasing the quality of your offering in terms of the kinds of food, the way it's being cooked, the mood of your offering. You always, again, with those objectives, you want at the end of your instruction for people to be able to demonstrate that they can know or do something that they weren't demonstrating at the beginning of your instruction. So you're asking them to make some kind of a jump from what they already know or they already do to a higher level. So you want to know, well, what are they doing right now? If they're already chanting 16 rounds, you want to look at quality. If they're not chanting any rounds, you want to try to get them to chant a little bit every day. If they're only chanting 2-3 rounds, you want to get them to increase. So you want to give them a step that's going to feel accessible to them, not too high and not too low. To do that, you have to have some idea of what their practice is. Now, what if you have a mixed group with different levels of practice? Then you want to teach in such a way that everybody feels that they can make a step up. Okay, next question. What are the needs and interests of the people I'm teaching? So we have a separate lesson on this, and it's certainly very important to remind ourselves that what is my specific audience needs? If I'm teaching a bunch of teenagers, their felt needs are going to be different than a bunch of people in their 60s. If I'm teaching brahmacharis, their felt needs are going to be different than if I'm teaching people who are married with children. Now, we talked about how there's universal needs for things like authenticity and security and connection. But the way we're feeling right now, what do I need in my life, is going to be a little different according to different groups of people. And the sense of people who are new to Krishna consciousness, what they feel they need, are going to be different than longtime devotees. Then is there some sort of external requirement that's inducing people to come to my class? Or are they coming entirely voluntarily? You might say, well, why do I need to know this? Well, if somebody's coming to your class because of any kind of compulsion, like people who live in the ashram and they're told, well, you have to go to Bhagavatam class every day or we won't feed you or we won't let you live in the ashram. Or children who are coming to class because their parents are telling them they have to come to class. Or even someone who's attending a Bhakti Shastri class because they're told, well, you have to get a Bhakti Shastri degree or you can't get Brahmin initiation. Whenever there's any degree of compulsion, people are not as attentive. They're much more likely to be doing other things in the class and spacing out, looking at their phone and making garlands. And their enthusiasm for the topic is not going to be as great. Whenever you have people who are there with any degree of compulsion, you've got to engage them more. Maybe you have to be more entertaining, or you have to be more interactive, or something. Your message, your delivery needs to be more compelling. So to have some idea, are people here because they want to be here or because they have to be here? It makes a difference as to how you present things. When people are coming entirely voluntarily, they're generally much more receptive. Then we have this question is, does my audience have any kind of skepticism or doubt about what I'm presenting? Am I presenting something that to them they go, oh, really? I don't know. I don't think so. Or do they have some kind of previous difficult experience with what I'm teaching? Are these likely people, they've been taught things like this before, but maybe in a very coercive environment or some kind of difficulty, and they have some sort of emotional resistance to what I'm teaching. So this is looking at whether or not I have a resistant audience. So this question goes beyond, are they being compelled to come? Are they here voluntarily? To, are they going to be resistant? So if people are going to have resistance or previous bad experiences, it's wise for me as the teacher to surface that and deal with that, to address it. Well, you may have some questions about this because it may seem really unlikely, and get into that. Don't just assume that people are receptive and that people are open to what you're teaching them. Find out a little bit about their background. So taking the time to know something about our audience is a very essential part of teaching. We're never teaching content. Never. We're never teaching mathematics or good japa or good marital relationships. We're always teaching people. We're never even teaching spirituality. We're always teaching people. Let's say somebody asks you for directions. Before you can give them directions, the first question is always, where are you now? If I want somebody to get someplace, I can't tell them whether to turn left, right, or go straight ahead unless I know their current location. In the same way, as a teacher, I can't achieve my aims in teaching. I can't get the students to achieve their objectives unless I know where they are now. Getting to know your audience is therefore absolutely essential in our very personalistic philosophy of spiritual life. Thank you. Hare Krishna. Hare Krishna. In this lesson, we're going to be looking at the relationship between instructional design and time. Krishna taught the whole Bhagavad Gita to Arjuna in less than an hour. But generally, when we want to teach the Bhagavad Gita, it takes many hours, over many weeks, sometimes over many months. We need to make sure that we give our students enough time to really assimilate learning. That's just as important as what we're teaching. If you teach something and then go on to the next thing and go on to the next thing and go on to the next thing and go on to the next thing, and nobody has time to assimilate and understand the learning, they don't retain it, they can't do much with it. If we're teaching information and knowledge, we want to give students enough time to assimilate, to understand. That may mean to ask questions, to have a discussion. Let's say we're teaching skills. Now, I was recently with a very experienced educator who told me that when he teaches skills, he doesn't give the students an opportunity to practice those skills. No. Whenever we're teaching skills, we want to make sure that the students have an opportunity to practice those skills. Not only that, we want to make sure that the students have an opportunity to get feedback on their practice as to the degree that they've understood the skills and practiced the skills and their level of expertise at that degree. Now, ideally, they then have yet another time to practice those skills where we give further feedback and where they've shown whether or not they've assimilated the first feedback. So with knowledge and information, time for understanding, discussion, questions. With skills, some time to practice the skills where we watch them, we give them feedback. Then ideally another time to practice where we see how well they've assimilated that feedback. Now, sometimes other people or circumstances dictate how much time we have. Somebody may say, hey, you've got an hour to teach this, or you've got 3 hours, or you've got 5 hours over a week. Now, whenever we're assigned an amount of time, we modify what we want to teach according to the time available. One of the biggest mistakes that anyone can do in instructional design is trying to force more teaching into the time available simply because theoretically we think, wow, everybody should know this. So I'm going to try to shove 5 hours worth of instruction into 1 hour. Now, there are other times when we can choose how much time we're going to take. When we can say, hey, I need an hour a day over 5 days, or I need a total of 10 hours. In that case, we start with, hey, this is what's ideal for people to know. And then we calculate how much time it would take to teach that, and then we teach for that amount of time. That really gives us two different approaches. One is we have a fixed amount of time, and we assess, okay, what can be taught well in that amount of time? And I have my instruction match the time. The other is that when we start with, okay, this is ideally what I should teach, this is how much time I need, and then I make the time match the instruction. So am I making the instruction match the time, or the time match the instruction? Now, in practice, I'm rarely in a situation as a teacher where I can just totally have as much time as I want to teach ideally. So it's unusual that 100% I can make the time match the instruction. So sometimes there's some sort of a compromise. So usually when someone says, how much time do you need? You kind of come somewhere in the middle. But in any case, the instruction and the time have to match. There are some other considerations about time. That is the time of day, the time of the week, the time of the year. If we're going to look in terms of a year, there are certain times of year in each locality where the people that we'd most like to teach or who would most benefit from our instruction are not going to be there. Certain times people take vacations. Certain times people are involved with large festivals or exams or something that's going to either not allow them to attend our classes, or if they're attending, they're going to be very distracted. And the same applies not only to a year, but also to a week. So certain days of the week are going to be particularly difficult for certain audiences. So it's very wise to know the habits and the schedules of the people we're going to teach. And this may vary from one location to another. So if we're teaching the same lesson or the same courses in different localities, what's ideal time of year here may be a terrible time of year here, and what's an ideal day of the week here may be a terrible day of the week here. Now, also the time of the day is going to determine what people can come. I was really surprised in Mexico City that I taught a class on organizational culture on a Tuesday morning at 10 o'clock, and we had about 50 people come, a lot of men as well as women. I was really surprised that during normal working hours on a weekday, we had such a big audience. But generally, the time of the day is crucial. If people are working, or people are going to school, or what the traffic jams are like, people having to travel. If you teach children, keep in mind that children generally go to bed earlier than adults. They're more tired and less receptive at the end of the day, and they often have homework to do and school to go to in the next day. In general, as a general rule, it's not an absolute because there's different what we call chronotypes. So everybody has their individual best times of the day. But as a general rule, people are more alert and receptive in the morning, and they're the least alert and receptive in the early to mid part of the afternoon after they've eaten lunch. So you really want to plan more active, experiential learning things at that, 1 to 4 o'clock in the afternoon slot, and you can have a little bit more cerebral, intellectual things early in the morning. One thing that I notice that has become a trend in a lot of the Hare Krishna movement is late night classes where people are eating a meal between 9 and 11 o'clock at night. And then often they have to drive home for 1 or 2 hours. So they're eating this late night meal. They're not getting to bed until midnight. So our final consideration of time doesn't have to do with the learning itself, but it has to do with how what we're teaching is going to impact the rest of these people's lives. Now, as Krishna conscious teachers, we should be concerned with the sadhana of our students. And we should teach at hours, and we should feed people at hours that will make getting up early in the morning and have early morning sadhana something easy rather than difficult. So you just imagine if you're teaching a class that's going from, 8 to 9:30 at night, about the value of good japa, and then at 9:30 you're serving a meal and people aren't getting home till 11:30 at night. You're really sort of working against the very thing that you're teaching. So we should also keep considerations of time in that way, that how is what I'm doing affecting the rest of people's time. Thank you. Hare Krishna. Hare Krishna. In our last lesson, we looked at the resource of time. Now we're going to look at additional resources that we will use in our teaching. And other resources have the same two paths. The first is you see, what resources do I have? And you adjust your teaching to match the resources. The second path is you say, what resources would be optimal for what I would like to teach? And then you go out and get them. Often it's either that I just have to use what I have, or I get somewhere in the middle. Now, what do we mean by resources? Let's take a look at 4 categories. So we're looking at the venue, the cost, the materials, and other teachers or helpers. Okay, first we're looking at the venue, and we have here a list of 10 questions about the venue. Now, in looking at these questions, you might wonder, why do we even care about these? Okay, please take a minute to read over the questions. Why are we asking these questions? Well, the first question involves the size of the space. That tells us how many people can sit there comfortably. Do we have to limit the audience that's coming? I mean, is there some way we're going to deal with that? I remember once giving a class on a topic that I knew would be very popular, and the organizers of the festival had put me in a very small space, and I said, I don't think that's going to work. So they put me in a slightly bigger space, and even then we had an overflow crowd. Then what about the shape of the space? If you're going to be using something that you're projecting on the wall, or a whiteboard, blackboard, flip chart, some kind of visual, is the space shaped such that everybody can see? If not, you really have to adjust where you're going to put things and where people are going to sit. You don't want to simply go ahead and present something and half your people can't see it. Then where are people going to sit? Do they have to sit on the floor? Is the floor hard? Is the floor cold? Will there be mats? Will there be chairs? Is it likely you're going to have some people who will struggle to sit on the floor and will want chairs? Are you likely to have more of a non-devotee audience that are more accustomed to sitting on chairs? Are you going to have some kind of seating that's conducive for the audience that you have? What about the cleanliness of the place? Many years ago, I was asked to teach classes on Bhagavad Gita, chapters 13 through 18, a lot of which deal with the modes of material nature. And the room that I was given to teach in was so dirty. The bathroom was filthy, the room was dirty. And I said to the organizers, I really can't teach about the modes of material nature in a dirty place. If a place is dirty, there'll be dust in the air. It's going to distract from people's learning. It's going to be hard for people to concentrate. Is it a comfortable temperature? Now, ask anybody, what is our basic physiological need? Everybody will say air. Say, what's the next one? And most people will say water, but that's not true. Our next physiological need after air is temperature. If the room is too hot or too cold, people's thoughts will be so absorbed in basic physiological survival that they won't be able to be attentive to the class. So you want to make sure the temperature is adjusted. That may mean that an hour or two before the class, a heater or an air conditioner is turned on or windows are opened, which relates to the next topic of airflow. As air is our most basic physiological need, if there isn't enough oxygen in the room, people will literally start falling asleep, not because you're a bad teacher, but because their brain can't work. So if you're going to be teaching, make sure there's enough oxygen in the room and that the air is flowing. If it's going to be a long class or a long session, you want to make sure that pure drinking water is available. Is the class going to be outside or inside? That has a lot to do with what kind of audiovisual materials you can have, how you can set up the room, to know something about that venue. Is there going to be a problem with insects? Do you need some sort of screens, or do you need some sort of, all out for mosquitoes? In some parts of the world, there's going to be a problem with animals. So you want to arrange for that. That will be very distracting if you're teaching a class and, monkey walks in and sits up at the front of the room. Is there going to be any travel involved for the teacher and the participants, which will affect, as we talked about in the other lesson, the time that you're going to be teaching? Then you also want to look at what materials you're going to be using. So do you need any printed materials for your course? You need to have those ready. I remember going to a 15-hour course on a highly technical philosophical point that used a lot of Sanskrit terms, and there was no printed material for us to be able to remember what those points were. I mean, you personally had to take copious notes, and as some of these were Sanskrit terms, you might not even catch them and be able to write them down. So is there a need for printed materials? Again, the more technical the topic, the more unfamiliar the words, the longer the course, the more you're likely to need some printed materials that people can help to organize their thoughts during the course, and maybe to take with them to remind them of the course after they leave. Do you need a blackboard, a whiteboard, or a flip chart? Now, that may be useful for interactive sessions. It may also be useful, again, to help people to remember and organize their thinking if you have a lot of complex terms. If you have a blackboard, whiteboard, flip chart, do you have markers or chalk? Make sure that that's there before you get started. Sometimes having blank paper, pencils, paper, if you have people doing writing exercises, obviously sometimes projector, screen, or a wall, and you need something specific to your learning experience. I mean, sometimes we're going to have different learning experiences where we may use different materials that are not normally widely available. Another resource that we might not think about are other teachers or assistants. If it's going to be a very large group, something that has a lot of interactivity, a lot of group work, or if different groups are going to be doing different things, we may need other teachers or assistants to help us. There's a workshop I do for children and parents that involve about 10 different activities going on in different parts of the room simultaneously. And so for that, we need assistants. The assistants need some prior instruction. The assistants need to gather materials in order to teach. The venue has to be prepared. So there are certain kinds of teaching for which you really need those sort of resources. Also, for a lot of teaching, we would benefit by advertising. And there are many places where there's no advertising at all, or it's advertised just that morning. But in many cases, good advertisement will really help bring in the students who will most benefit. And do we need anyone to arrange for previous printing or anything of that kind? So what are the steps to do when teaching? First, think about what you want to teach and find out what is readily available, what kind of venue, what kind of costs are involved, what assistance, what materials, and then decide what would be optimal for what you want to teach, and make some adjustment between what's readily available and a plan to get additional resources. Another thing that you really want to keep in mind is going to be costs. So sometimes the people attending a seminar have to pay to attend. They may have to pay to travel. They may have to pay for prasadam, accommodation. They may have to pay for the teaching itself. There may be costs in printing and so forth. And to figure out in advance if there are costs involved, who's going to pay for them, and who's going to do the purchasing. So altogether, when teaching, one really needs to have these resources in mind. At the very least, you have the venue, even if you don't have any other resources. But often, for the objectives and aims that you have, for the type of learning experiences that you want to do, you are going to want to have a number of resources. Think about what's there, what you need, find the harmony, and make sure they are provided. Hare Krishna. Hare Krishna. Today we're going to be looking at a very effective technique to meet our aims and objectives when doing instructional design, and that is to find the irreducible minimum. What is the irreducible minimum that each and every one of our students needs to know, to do, to be in order to achieve our objective? After we figure that out, then the teacher focuses on that irreducible minimum and makes sure that every student learns it. This particular lesson is based on material from Dr. Bruce Wilkinson. It's part of what he calls the law of retention and is part of a course and a book called The 7 Laws of the Learner. Okay, we're going to be looking at a picture now for 10 seconds. Give it that full 10 seconds, and then you're going to try to remember what was in the picture. Ready? Go. All right. What do you remember? Take some time, pause this, and write down everything you remember about the picture. Let's look back at that picture and compare what's in the picture to what you remember. How much of it were you able to remember? Is there anything that you missed? When we're teaching, we want to make sure that our students remember and can use the irreducible minimum that they have to master in order for us to meet our aims and objectives. So our maxims or principles are, first of all, something that may surprise you. And that is whether or not our students remember the facts or the skills or whatever it is we're trying to teach is not their responsibility, but ours. And you might say, well, that's not really fair. But really, if people haven't learned, I haven't taught. And it's very helpful for me as a teacher to accept the concept that I'm the one responsible for whether or not anyone remembers what I have taught them. If I think that I'm not responsible, if I think it's the student's responsibility, then I may just simply throw out whatever content is there and okay, it's your problem. I won't be as effective as a teacher. One might ask, well, is it absolutely true that it's the responsibility of the teacher? Well, no, it isn't. And if we were teaching this course to students, we'd say, hey, it's your responsibility to remember. But as the teacher, it's helpful for us to feel it's my responsibility whether or not the students remember the most essential aspects of the class. Now, the next thing is that retention of facts is effective only if they are understood. Or if we're talking about skills, skills are effective only if they're practiced. So if I remember a bunch of facts, but I have no idea what they mean, I have no idea what to do with them, that's not really very effective. If you want to go into more of the depth of understanding, please see our lessons on Bloom's taxonomy. The third maxim is that as the student understands the relevance of the facts to his or her life, then definitely they will remember more of them. Now, imagine the difference between studying geography in theory. You know, let's say I'm studying the geography of the Maldives Islands, but I've never been there. I never plan to go there. I'm not likely to remember. But if I actually go to the Maldives and I have to negotiate between the islands, I have to get around, I'm much more likely to remember those facts. So, of course, this particular maxim has to do with needs, the connection between what I'm teaching and what people need. So if I'm teaching some sort of facts or skills that people actually need, then of course they're more likely to remember them. Let's look at the maxim number 4. Maxim number 4 deals with the fact that the students are going to be more likely to remember if I, as the teacher, focus on what's most important to know. Now, I remember having a teacher when I was in high school, when I was in secondary school, who spent the entire class writing on the board, this huge blackboard, everything about history. And on the test could be anything that she'd written on the board. That meant that each of us students had to memorize a huge amount of minutia and trivia. And by trying to remember everything, we ended up remembering almost nothing. How so many years later, I really can't remember anything I learned in that class. Having the teacher focus on the facts that are most important mean, first of all, that as the teacher, going through the material and deciding what's the irreducible minimum, what's the smallest unit of information or skills necessary to say that the students have got this minimum of achieving the objectives. Now, how are you going to decide what that is? For the same topic, the irreducible minimum will change according to the audience, the amount of time, and the specific objectives of the class. The irreducible minimum that I want people to know in a 1-hour Bhagavad Gita overview, and the audience is people who've been in Krishna consciousness for at least 5 years, is going to be very different than the irreducible minimum that I want people to know in a 1-week Bhagavad Gita overview with people who've been practicing Krishna consciousness for 15 years. Now, we may say, well, does Srila Prabhupada do this? Does he go through information and find what's most important? Does Krishna do this? Because again, there's a lot of teachers that say, hey, I'm going to throw everything at you. It's your problem as a student to figure out what's most important, not my problem. I just give you everything. We're going to look at some examples of where Krishna says, hey, this is most important, or where Srila Prabhupada says, this is what's most important. Let's take a look at some of these examples now. The first 2 examples we're looking at here are from Krishna. Then we're looking at an example from Srila Prabhupada. Let's read this. This is from Bhagavad Gita, chapter 10, text 42. But what need is there, Arjuna, for all this detailed knowledge? With a single fragment of myself, I pervade and support this entire universe. So Krishna is telling us, look, I've just given you all this detailed knowledge in chapter 10. You know, among fishes, I am the shark. Of immovable objects, I am the Himalayas. Of mountains, I am Meru, and so forth. He's given all this information, and then he says, you know, it's not very important. The next example, although it's from a purport, is related to something that Krishna said. This is from Bhagavad Gita, chapter 14, text 1, purport, where Prabhupada says, the knowledge explained in this chapter is proclaimed by the Supreme Lord to be superior to the knowledge given so far in other chapters. So Krishna makes a declaration right at the beginning of chapter 14. Hey, this is more important than what I've taught you so far. He's signaling it. He's flagging it. So we have an example from chapter 10 of where Krishna says, I told you all this, but it's not very important. And then we have an example from chapter 14 where Krishna is signaling this is very important. Now we look at an example from Nectar of Devotion, chapter 6. Of course, Prabhupada is getting this from Rupa Goswami, so you could say this is an example from Prabhupada, but also from our acharyas. Let's read it together. Now, the total regulative principles come to an aggregate of 64 items. As we have mentioned, the first are the primary 10 regulative principles. Then come the secondary 10 regulative principles, and added to these are 44 other activities. So altogether, there are 64 items for discharging the regulative principles of devotional service. Out of these 64 items, 5 items, namely worshiping the deity, hearing Srimad Bhagavatam, associating among the devotees, Sankirtan, and living in Mathura, are very important. So we're told, okay, there's 10 that are primary, another 10 that are secondary, then there's another 44. And of all of them, these 5 are the most important, right? These are very important. In fact, Rupa Goswami gives another list of the 3 most important. So we have lists given here. These are most important, these are less. This is something you can know, something you can do, but it's not as important, right? In Nectar Devotion, chapter 2, we're hearing again here from Srila Prabhupada and of course from Rupa Goswami. We can read this. Actually, this is the most basic of all regulative principles. When the order is that one should always remember Krishna, the prohibition is that one should never forget him. With this simple order and prohibition, all the regulative principles are found complete. Here we're given what's most important. The reason for these examples is that Srila Prabhupada, our acharyas, Krishna himself, does indicate, hey, this is really important. This is not so important. It's less important. This is not very important at all. They let us know. Now that means that the Lord, the acharyas, they've gone through and thought about it. What's more important? What's less important? Next point. If we want students to retain what they've learned, then that means that the teacher organizes the facts so that they're easy to memorize. And we're going to have a separate lesson on that idea. Next, retention strengthens long-term memory through regular review. When you review something over and over again, it moves it from your short-term memory, which we remember for a few moments, to long-term memory, which we can remember, hopefully, for our whole life. And the idea of retention, the last item, number 7, is that we want to minimize our memorization time and maximize our application time. I remember when I was first learning the Sanskrit alphabet, I was trying for 6 months to just learn the alphabet in isolation. And I particularly struggled with the conjuncts and some of the conjuncts, some of the vowel abbreviations. And then I came to India and I decided to try to read Hindi signs. And Hindi uses almost exactly the same alphabet as Sanskrit. And by applying my knowledge to reading, I found that I retained everything much quicker. Within a few days of applying my knowledge, then the retention was there. So we don't want to spend a lot of time on rote memorization. We do want to review, so things go into long-term memory. But we want to review in a way that our students are applying. So what do? Our method is we research the material, we go through the material, we sift it out, we analyze it, we evaluate it. We decide. It's our responsibility as the teacher to decide what's the irreducible minimum that's necessary in order for my students to meet their learning objectives and my aims. Then I prioritize the information according to what's most important. In the class itself, I actually tell them, what's the irreducible minimum? What's most important? Then I arrange the important material in such a way that it will be easy to remember. I structure it, I simplify it, and I make it into a package so that people can remember it. We call this Mind Easy, or Dr. Bruce Wilkinson calls it Mind Easy, and we'll be going over that in another lesson. Thank you. Hare Krishna. Hare Krishna. In this particular lesson, we're going to look at different learning experiences, or you could call them different teaching methods that we can employ when doing instructional design. There are many, many ways to teach and learn. In a particular class, we might use only one kind of learning method, we might use 2, we might use 4 or 5. And when planning, we want to consider each learning objective. We want to make sure that each learning objective has at least one learning experience. So we talked before about making sure each aim has a corresponding objective. Now we want to make sure that each learning objective has a corresponding learning experience that will make sure that your students or participants actually achieve that objective. We're going to be looking through a list of a number of different kinds of learning experiences. And as we go through these lists, I want you to consider for each class or course or lesson that you're going to be designing, think what are the benefits and difficulties of each kind of learning experience. You want to pick learning experiences that will fit with the time available, the physical space, the resources available, the nature of your students, participants, audiences, that will be comfortable for you as a teacher and will be most likely to achieve your objectives. Always keep the objectives in mind. And provide some variety because we're all individuals. Different people learn in different ways. If you only have one learning experience that you use over and over and over again, only a certain type of person is really going to benefit from your instruction. Okay, we're going to be looking now at some typical learning experiences. The first one is reading. One of the simplest things to do. This can mean that you read aloud, maybe you pause, explain a word, have some discussion. It can also mean that you give people something to read and they read it themselves. Then there's lecturing, obviously one of the most ancient and time-tested methods, which is very useful when the teacher is very knowledgeable on a particular subject. As we've stressed many times, the presentation must be relevant to the student's needs. It must be in terms that they can readily understand. While lecturing is one of the most efficient methods, it's not necessarily the most effective, especially if it does not really involve the participants in any way. Then there's visual tools, though this could mean ready-made pictures, felt boards, films. At best if your visuals are dynamic rather than static. If you really need an image and you can't provide it in something tangible, in a projection or whatever, you can always paint the picture using words so people can imagine it in their minds. Then there's discussion. Discussion is a distant cousin of the lecture. There can be a discussion among the entire group or by splitting the students into smaller groups. Be aware that if you have a discussion in a group larger than about 6 people, that probably only your most outgoing people will participate in the discussion. About 60% of people will remain silent. One of the reasons that many teachers break into smaller groups for discussion is this way the discussion is more likely to involve all the members of your audience. Then there's rote repetition. This is where the teacher says something and the student repeats. And this can be just as simple as I say, you repeat. I say, you repeat. Now you can also add enhancements. One enhancement is song. Of course, we sing slokas. Anything that's put into some kind of song really makes it easier to remember for something that we want to use rote. Or just using rhyme and meter even without music. In addition, we can use drama. By that, we don't necessarily mean costumes and a stage, but even if you use mudras. Let's say you want to teach people to remember the translation, the Sanskrit or Bengali, and the translation of slokas. If the words are put with mudras, or here's Arjuna, he's pulling his bow, and you have some kind of action, it makes it easier to remember. Many times people will take the translations and put them into rhyme and meter to make them easier to remember. Sometimes they'll put the translations into song, sometimes rhyme, meter, and song. And imagine if you had the verses in Sanskrit or Bengali, then translated with rhyme, meter, song, and dramatic gestures. How much would that stick in your memory? Keep in mind that when you use rote repetition, that the more the student understands what they're learning, the more they're going to be able to remember it. Then there's a practical demonstration. You could say this is a kind of visual tool. So instead of drawing a picture of an arrow hitting a target, I go outside, I get a real arrow, I get a real target, and I shoot the arrow at the target. So if a teacher uses things like blocks, shells, pebbles to demonstrate mathematical principles, that's also using this particular demonstration method. Then there's practical experience. So this is when, the students go in the kitchen and make rice. They make a chapati. They serve prasadam. They dress the deities. They're not watching you do it, which is a demonstration, or someone else do it, but they're experiencing it themselves. Now, sometimes we have a simulation of experience. Let's say that, you want to see the internal organs of a frog, but you don't want to cut up a frog. So you may have a simulation of cutting up a frog on the computer. So you have a virtual experience. Then there's showing. Showing is not a practical demonstration of me doing it. And it's not saying, okay, you go and have an experience. It's what we would call hand-holding. You may have seen that picture, the photograph of Srila Prabhupada holding a student's hand, and helping him to form the Sanskrit letters, that's showing. If you physically guide somebody through a somersault, that's showing. You're taking someone's hands and showing them how to put a turban on the deity, that's showing. Then there's field trips. So we go out of the classroom, we go out of our normal learning place, and we go and see something out in the field. You could say that's like a big experience or a big simulation. Then there's games, making learning into a game. Now, one of the advantages of making learning into a game is that most people want to win a game, and that wanting to win a game makes a need that the students want to fulfill. Also, there's a lot of research that shows that we learn more when we're having fun, and as many times people enjoy games, the learning is often expedited. So that we went into in detail. We're going to look at some other lists. Those lists that we look at will include some of what we've already looked at in more depth. We're just going to read through these quickly. These are different lists compiled by different people. So here's one: lecture, use of a flip chart or board, graphics, discussion, brainstorming, students teaching each other, students making a presentation, people tutoring each other, so the students tutoring each other, or slightly more advanced students teaching less advanced, group work, pair work, some sort of multimedia, a kind of hands-on project, having a quiz. A quiz may not always be assessment. It may also sometimes be a learning experience, games, investigation, experiments, debate, storytelling, music, drama, simulation, role play, field trips, rote memorization, research, guided practice, and demonstration or modeling. Now, again, just to recap, when you're deciding what learning experiences you want to use, again, what's going to fit with the time you have, the physical space, the resources available, the nature of your audience, what's going to be comfortable for you as the teacher, what's going to be likely to achieve your objectives. Always keep the objectives in mind. And finally, again, provide some variety. Most of us teachers pick the learning experiences that we are most comfortable with or that we like the most, and we tend to just repeat those same ones over and over again. But keep in mind, we're all individuals. We all learn in different ways, and by varying your learning experiences, you will make learning more accessible to everyone you teach. Thank you. Hare Krishna. Hare Krishna. We talked in a previous lesson about finding the irreducible minimum that all of our students had to know in order to achieve our objectives and our aim. And we mentioned there that we wanted to make that irreducible minimum easy to understand. We're going to turn again to the work of Dr. Bruce Wilkinson. This is from The Law of Retention, from his 7 Laws of the Learner, and look at how to take that most basic information or skills that our students need to know in order to master the minimum, to meet the objectives, and make it easy for them to know. He calls this mind easy. All right, we're talking about memorization, something that's going to become indelible in their memory, to go from short-term to long-term memory. So the primary method of memorization is review. Now, review is only fully effective when people understand what it is that they're memorizing. You want to review things in the same words and the same order until it's memorized. Like, you're not that body, you're not that body, you're not that body. Srila Prabhupada would use the same words in the same order. You want to review things most intensely when you first teach them, and then review periodically later on. So regularly practice and then space further and further apart in practice as you go on teaching. You want to keep reviewing until all of your students have mastery over the minimum. Then you have achieved your aims. And you want to use a variety of methods to review. Now, in this little chart here, you see the difference between bad teaching and good teaching. So in bad teaching, which you see at the top, the teacher simply gathers the material and outlines it, and during the class covers it. And after class, it's up to the students to prioritize the material, to put it in a form that's easy to remember, to memorize it, to practice use, and get independent use. What good teachers do is before they teach in their instructional design planning. They gather the material, they outline the material, they cover the material, they prioritize it, and they mnemonize it. They put it in a form that's easy to remember. During the class, the students memorize it and practice it, and the only thing the students do after the class is independent use. Now, how do we make things easy to remember? We have several different methods. One is we can take what we want the students to remember and represent it in a picture. Another, we can take what we want the students to remember and express it in a story or with logic. For example, talking about the Bhagavatam as representing Krishna's lotus feet in the first canto all the way up to his smiling face. You can transfer the facts by an alphabet. You can have some kind of phrase where the first letter of each word in the phrase stands for something you want the students to remember. You can have a rhyme or you can have an acronym. You can associate the facts with objects or actions, as in geography. You can say, all right, all of you there wave. Okay, there's the ocean with the waves. You can impress the facts with a drama. You can also note them with music, just like most of us learn the alphabet with some sort of song. You can also summarize your facts with graphs and charts. Let's look at an example. Please take a moment and read over this Bhagavatam verse and purport from 8.10.6. Okay, I've looked at this verse and purport, and I, as the teacher, have decided what's the minimum irreducible content that I would need for someone to understand to say that they've understood this verse and purport, again, at a minimal level. And the minimum content that I've decided, and this is for adults at a morning class, there's a half an hour, and I've got 10 minutes to cover this particular part of the content, okay? So I'm going to take 10 minutes of a half an hour class with adults in the morning. So this is my irreducible minimum for that time, resources, and audience. It's who is Rahu? They should know who is Rahu. Who are the celestial demons and demigods? That there are demons and demigods among human society and within us. Now, what am I going to do to make it mind easy? I've come up with this little rhyme. Rahu got ahead, but the demigods got ahead. So I have ahead as two separate words for Rahu and ahead as they have an advantage for the demigods. So Rahu got ahead, but the demigods got ahead. So that's taking my irreducible minimum and putting it in a mind easy form. Let's look at another example. This is from Bhagavad Gita 16:21. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this verse. There are 3 gates leading to hell: lust, anger, and greed. Every sane man should give these up, for they lead to the degradation of the soul. Now, how are we going to find the irreducible content there and make it mind easy? Well, the irreducible content is pretty clear. There are these 3 problems: lust, anger, and greed, and they're a real problem for us. So I've got to know what lust is. I've got to know what anger is. I've got to know what greed is. I've got to explain why they're impediments. So here's a mind easy. Lust, anger, greed lag our spiritual life. So to lag means to slow down, to impede, to pull behind. But lag also, L-A-G, has the first letters of lust, anger, and greed. Therefore, it's mind easy. Lust, anger, and greed lag our spiritual life. An easy mind easy for that irreducible minimum. Here's another mind easy. It's a picture, a symbolic picture, right? We talked about Krishna talks about the 3 gates to hell: lust, anger, and greed. So here we see a graphic of hell, someone burning in hell. Here are 3 gates. was symbolized with lust, anger, and greed. Every sane man should give these up, for they lead to the degradation of the soul. And we have someone in the background who's not going to those gates, but who's taking a different path. So you have this picture as a symbolic representation of the verse, making the concepts mind easy. Here's another picture or graphic for the you're not that body, right? And just looking at this picture, here we see the body as a machine, super soul, the soul in the heart, managing the body. This is a mind easy for that concept. If you wonder, well, where do we find mind easy from Prabhupada and the Shastra? Why don't we read this nice example? This is from Bhagavatam, Canto 10, Chapter 9, Text 1-2 purport, where Srila Prabhupada talks about mind easy. Please take a few moments to read this. So I'm sure you noticed some interesting points in this section from the purport. One is that Srila Prabhupada talks about how there was formerly a custom, that if you wanted to remember something, you poeticized it, you put it to song. He talks about how Mother Yasoda did this and how she was singing these poeticized songs while she was working. And then twice here, Srila Prabhupada says that we should do this. He says, this should be the practice of anyone eager to be Krishna conscious 24 hours a day. And he says, if we want to stay in Krishna consciousness, we should follow such verses. So Srila Prabhupada is giving us a very direct instruction 2 times in this purport to employ mind-easy techniques in order to remember things. Some of Srila Prabhupada's mind-easy, this painting and diorama of changing bodies. So taking this concept of changing in life, Dehi nosmin yata dehe, from changing from boyhood to youth to old age. Prabhupada has made mind easy in this painting and this diorama. Some more of Srila Prabhupada's mind easy, where he said democracy means demon crazy, that surfers are sea sufferers, or where he would say you can love God or you can love dog. Others, eating, sleeping, mating, and defending, the very word ISKCON, which is an acronym, birth, death, old age, and disease, simple living, high thinking, back to Godhead. These are all phrases that anybody associated with the International Society for Krishna Consciousness certainly knows backwards and forwards and inside and out. Why? Because they're simple to understand, easy to remember. Srila Prabhupada repeated them over and over and over and over and over again. What about the Shastra? Here we have in Bhagavad Gita 2.22 purport, Srila Prabhupada is referring to the different Upanishads that compare the soul and the supersoul to 2 birds in a tree. One bird is eating the fruit, that's us, the conditioned jiva, and one bird, the supersoul, is watching. Another example of mind easy from Shastra, this is in the purport to Bhagavad Gita 6.34, where the Kata Upanishad is comparing the body to a chariot, the senses to the horses, and so forth. And having this comparison between the body and the chariot makes it much easier to understand what's the relationship between the soul, the body, the mind, and the intelligence. It's very easy for teachers to say that it's just my responsibility to present the content of this lesson in any way I want, and it's the responsibility of the students to make it mind easy and to memorize it. However, if we take it that it's our responsibility as the teacher to find that irreducible minimum and then to put it in a form that people are likely to remember, then certainly we are becoming expert in our service to Guru and Krishna. Thank you very much. Hare Krishna. Hare Krishna. In this lesson, we're going to look at the role of assessment or evaluation in instructional design. So assessment means to measure whether or not we have actually met our objectives in our teaching. to what extent we have met those objectives. Maybe we've met them partially, maybe we've met them fully. I'd like you to pause this recording and write down, why do you think we need to have assessments in our teaching? Now that you've written down some ideas, we'd like to look at least 4 benefits of assessment. The first benefit is to evaluate our own instructional plan. I think a lot of times people think that what we're assessing are the students, but actually we're assessing our own instruction. Was my plan pitched at the right level? Did people find it too easy and they were just bored? Was it too challenging and they needed prior knowledge? Are they even interested? Is it meeting their needs? How engaged were they? Tells me something about my instructional plan. Then, of course, also, assessments monitor the progress the students are making. It helps them to understand their own progress and what they need to adjust. Assessment also helps me as a teacher know about my delivery of the plan. So maybe I had a great plan, but somehow I didn't deliver it in a way that people were really learning. In addition, assessment allows me to give a report to a higher authority or to an institution as to what extent the aims and objectives of the teaching have been realized. If the assessment shows that they haven't been, then the higher authority, the people running the institution, may make some change. Maybe the course shouldn't be offered at all. Maybe some sort of preliminary course should be offered. Maybe something more challenging should be offered. There's 2 main types of assessment, summative and formative. Sum is at the end and formative is in the process. You could think of it, suppose you were driving from city A to city B. Summative assessment is once you've arrived at your destination and you look around and say, am I actually at city B or did I end up someplace else? Formative assessment is as you're driving, oh, am I going on the right road? Are there the proper landmarks that show me that I am progressing to city B? I think that most of us are most familiar with summative assessments. These take place generally not at the end of a single class, but generally at the end of a group of classes. They can take place after several weeks or even several months of instruction. They're often in the form of written quizzes and tests. They can also be in the form of oral presentations or some kind of project, but they really are looking at, have you achieved your destination? Formative assessments take place during the course of the teaching itself, and they're generally somewhat informal. Now, formative assessments allow you to adjust the teaching plan as you are teaching, or they can allow you to adjust the teaching plan or delivery for the next lesson. So it's something where you're getting feedback from the students and you're adjusting accordingly. Just like, again, if you were going to a destination, you're like, oh, wait a minute, and I shouldn't be on this road. And so you go back and do something else. And formative assessments can also help your students to understand their own needs, their own strengths, so they can take more responsibility for their own learning. Many times, formative assessments give your students more detailed information, especially if summative assessments only give them a grade, or you got an A, you got a C, or some kind of mark, you got 98%. Formative instructions tend to be more detailed and more nuanced. So what are some forms of formative assessments? One can be how participants respond to your questions. You're teaching, you're asking questions, and the way they respond, you're like, oops, and they didn't understand what I just taught them. Oh, wow, they're really bored. You can look at their body language while you're teaching. Are they engaged? Is there eye contact? Are they looking out the window? Are they sleeping? Are they just playing on their phone? And just to see how engaged they are. You know, do they get this blank look? You're teaching something, you look at your students, at your audience, and everyone just looks kind of, huh? Then you can back up and reteach that section. Also, the questions they ask you. So by the questions they ask you, you can think, oh my goodness, they're asking me a question that I covered 10 times in the class. And obviously I didn't teach it very well. Also, if in your class you have individual or group work and you see what they produce, you can understand, okay, they got that point, or no, they really didn't get this point. The same with individual or group presentations that are in the middle of the class where they can show how well, to what extent, or whether at all, they understood what you wanted to teach. Now, formative assessment can also be in grading and feedback of assignments that are not end of course exams. So let's say they're writing a paragraph, they're writing a paper, where they're doing some math problems and you're grading that, you're giving it back to them, you're discussing with them. This can be a way in the course of teaching that you understand how well you are teaching and how well they are learning. Now, assessments we tend to think of as being done just teacher to student, but the student can also assess him or herself. And you can have forums for the students to do self-assessments. In addition, you can have peer assessments. You can sometimes have the different students assess each other. Make sure that you include assessment in instructional design. If you're only designing one lesson, one class, most likely you're going to stick just to formative assessment, but do make sure that you have some explicit types of formative assessment included in your plan. If you're going to have a multi-class, multi-lesson course, then you probably should include both some formative and summative assessments. Any kind of instruction that leads to some sort of a certificate definitely has to have both formative and summative assessment. Some very important things to keep in mind. Assessment drives everything. Assessment tells you whether or not you've met your objectives. Just like there has to be a correlation between aims and objectives, there must be a correlation between objectives and assessment. Every objective has to be assessed in some way. And the form and content of the assessment controls what objectives are feasible. If you've written an objective you can't assess, you know what? You can't teach that objective. The assessments also determine what kind of learning experiences are planned. So really, the assessments are driving everything. And if you're involved in teaching something that has some control by somebody else, if someone else is giving you the assessments, you're going into some sort of project or institution or organization or whatever, and they've already got their own summative assessments. Their summative assessments are going to control to a large extent what objectives and learning experiences you as a teacher are able to teach. Remember also that all assessments have both a form and a content. If you are giving people a written essay, you're not only assessing the content of the essay, but how well they can write. If your assessment takes the form of them standing up and giving a speech on the topic, you're not only assessing the content of their speech, but how well they can speak. Always keep that in mind, and keeping that in mind, vary the form of your assessments so that you will be having assessments that get to showcase the strengths and the prior knowledge of each of your students. Thank you. Hare Krishna.